My son-in-law handed me a printed email and said, "We just need everyone on the same page." That was his way of telling me I was no longer welcome to show up at my own daughter's house without 48 hours written notice. I'm Bernard Okafor. I'm 58 years old. I spent 27 years working as a structural inspector for the county of Maricopa in Arizona. The kind of job where you learn early that what looks solid from the outside isn't always what it is underneath. I retired 3 years ago when my wife, June, got sick. Ovarian cancer. She lasted 14 months from the first diagnosis to the end, which is longer than the oncologist initially thought and shorter than anyone in our family could accept. She was the kind of woman who kept a prayer journal going back to 1989, who made peach cobbler from scratch every Sunday, who drove 40 minutes each way to sit with her mother in the nursing home every single week, even when her mother no longer recognized her face. She loved our daughter fiercely, and she adored our grandson Eli. Wait, no, that's not his name in the story. Let me start over the right way. My grandson's name is Miles. He is 4 years old. He has his mother's nose and my late wife's laugh. This open, unself-conscious thing that comes from somewhere deep in the chest, like he's genuinely surprised by how funny the world is. June used to say Miles was the punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. I didn't fully understand that until she was gone. My daughter is Angie. She married her husband Thad 7 years ago. Thad Brewster. He works in pharmaceutical sales, which means he spends a lot of time on the road and a lot of time talking about optimization. He is the kind of man who uses the word bandwidth in casual conversation and who once described his own wedding as a strong value proposition. I tried not to hold that against him. I genuinely tried. For the first few years, things were manageable. Angie and Thad lived about 25 minutes from me in Scottsdale, close enough that I could make it over for Sunday dinners without planning a whole expedition. After Miles was born, I started going over once a week, sometimes twice. I'd bring things, a board book, a bag of oranges from the tree in my backyard, a pack of those little Go-Gurt tubes Miles was obsessed with for about 6 months. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. Then Thad got promoted. The new territory meant more travel, which meant Angie was home alone with Miles more often, which meant, according to Thad, that the household needed more structure. I heard that phrase from Angie first, and then I started hearing it from Thad directly, always delivered with this reasonable, measured tone that made you feel unreasonable for disagreeing. The first change was the advance notice requirement. 48 hours, confirmed in writing. I thought it was a little formal, but I understood. Angie had a lot going on. I adapted. Then came the rule about not bringing food without prior approval. Miles had some sensitivities they were monitoring, Angie explained, and they wanted to keep his diet consistent. Fine. I stopped bringing the oranges and the Go-Gurt. Then there was a period of about 3 months where every time I called to confirm a visit, something had come up. Thad's schedule. Miles had a play date. The house was being painted. I drove over one Tuesday afternoon. I had confirmed the visit 2 days earlier in writing as requested, and Thad answered the door and told me it wasn't a good time. He said it pleasantly. He always said everything pleasantly. I drove home in the kind of silence that has weight to it. I mentioned it to Angie the next time we talked on the phone, just the one Tuesday, gently. She said Thad was really stressed with the new role and she was trying to keep things calm at home. "You know how he is," she said. I did know how he was. What I was starting to understand was that my daughter had begun to confuse keeping him calm with accepting whatever he decided. The document arrived by email about 5 months after June passed. Dad had drafted it himself. I could tell by the language, which was precise, the way pharmaceutical sales agreements are precise, all conditional clauses and defined terms. It was titled Family Visit Guidelines. It covered visit frequency, visit duration, prohibited topics of conversation, gift restrictions, photograph and social media policies, and overnight visit conditions. At the bottom, there was a line for my signature. I read it 3 times. Then I called Angie and asked if she'd seen it. She said she had. She said Thad just wanted things to be clear. I asked if she agreed with it. There was a pause that lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know, And then she said she thought it was a reasonable starting point for a conversation. I said I'd think about it. 2 weeks later, Thad called me directly. He wanted to know if I'd had time to review the document. I said I had some questions. He said he was happy to walk me through it. We talked for about 30 minutes, during which he explained in his measured pharmaceutical sales voice that he felt the current arrangement was creating stress in the household. He said he wanted to propose something that worked for everyone. What he proposed was this: if I wanted to maintain regular, scheduled access to Miles, he felt it was reasonable for me to contribute to the household's childcare expenses, a monthly payment of $600 transferred to a joint account designated for Miles's enrichment activities. He called it a family participation. He said a lot of families did something like this. I said I needed to think about it. He said, "Of course. Take your time." I sat on my back porch that night with a glass of water and looked at the orange tree in the yard. June and I planted that tree the year Angie started kindergarten. We did it on a Saturday morning, the three of us, and Angie was mostly interested in the dirt and not very much in the tree, but she was there. June used to say the tree was a record of the family. The rings inside the trunk mark every year we've been here, she'd say. Even the years we don't remember clearly. I thought about Thad's voice on the phone, that reasonable, optimized tone. I thought about $600 a month to see my 4-year-old grandson. I thought about the money I had given Angie and Thad 2 years earlier. Here is something I hadn't let myself look at directly until that night on the porch. When Angie and Thad bought their house in Scottsdale, a 4-bedroom in a gated community off Pima Road, I gave them $55,000. It was money from June's life insurance, the portion I had decided I didn't need for my own living expenses, and I gave it to them without conditions because they were family, and that's what you do. Or at least, that's what I believed. I gave them the money about 8 months before June died, when the diagnosis was still new, and I was in the mode of doing practical things because doing practical things kept me from falling apart. What I hadn't fully registered at the time was a conversation I'd had with my brother-in-law, Edmund, about a year after the gift. Edmund is a retired accountant, not a CPA, but he spent 30 years doing bookkeeping for mid-sized businesses in the Phoenix area. And he has the kind of mind that notices when numbers don't add up. He'd mentioned offhandedly once that Angie had asked him a question about joint accounts and asset protection. Something about whether funds in a jointly held account could be transferred to a single holder account without affecting the primary account's liability. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Neither had I. I thought about it a lot that night on the porch. The next morning, I called my neighbor, Clifton Price. Clifton had been a family law attorney in Phoenix for 22 years before he moved into mediation work, and I had known him long enough that I could be honest with him without embarrassment. I told him everything: the document, the monthly payment request, the money, Edmund's offhand comment. Clifton listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Bernard," he said, "I want you to do something before we talk again. I want you to gather every document related to the $55,000, any record of the transfer, any correspondence, anything in writing, and I'd like you to sit down with Edmund and ask him to pull whatever he knows about those account questions Angie brought to him." I asked why. Because in Arizona, the way a gift is documented, or not documented, matters under family law. And if that money moved in ways you weren't aware of, I'd like to understand the picture before anyone else makes a move. I called Edmund that same afternoon. We met for coffee at a Denny's near his house in Tempe, and I told him what was happening. He pulled out his phone and walked me through what he actually knew. Angie had called him twice over the course of about a year, once shortly after the home purchase and once about 16 months later. The second call was more specific. She'd wanted to know about the mechanics of moving funds from a joint account to a personal savings account in a way that was incremental and wouldn't trigger bank alerts. Edmund had given her general information because he hadn't understood the context. He'd had no idea she was asking about money that had come from me. What Clifton found, working with Edmund over the following 3 weeks, was a transfer pattern. Roughly $18,000 of the $55,000 I had given Angie and Thad had moved from their joint account into a savings account in Angie's name alone. Not a household account, not a college fund for Miles, a personal account. The transfers had been made in amounts between $800 and $1,200 over 14 months, timed, it appeared, to avoid any single transaction that would draw attention. I sat with that information for a long time. Here is what surprised me. My first feeling wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief. Because Angie was my daughter. And for a moment, I couldn't figure out whether she had done this on her own or whether Thad had guided her through it the way he guided her through everything. I still don't know. I've thought about it more than I should. What I decided was that it didn't fully matter. Not because it wasn't important, but because I needed to focus on what I could actually know and document rather than what I could only suspect. Clifton drafted 2 documents. The first was a formal letter asserting that the $55,000 had been given as a documented gift with a clear understood purpose, assisting with a home purchase, and that the subsequent transfer of a substantial portion of those funds into a separate personal account represented a misapplication of funds that warranted repayment. He did not use the word fraud. He was careful about that. He said precise and restrained. The second document was a statement of my rights as a grandparent under Arizona law. Arizona, unlike some states, does allow grandparents to petition for visitation rights when access is being unreasonably denied, provided certain conditions are met. Clifton laid out the conditions and noted that the documented pattern of restricted and conditional access appeared to meet the threshold for filing. He also included, as an attachment, a clean financial summary that Edmund had prepared, every transfer, every date, the account numbers redacted, but the amounts and sequence completely clear. I put both documents and the summary in a large manila envelope. I texted Angie on a Friday afternoon and asked if I could come by Saturday morning to see Miles. She said that was fine. I drove to Scottsdale with the envelope on the passenger seat next to me, and I thought about what I was going to say, and then I stopped thinking about it because I'd already decided. Thad answered the door. He was in his weekend mode, golf polo, coffee in hand, and he had the carefully neutral expression of a man who has been watching the driveway from the front window. Behind him, I could hear Miles somewhere in the house, that running commentary children make when they're playing by themselves. A kind of narration of everything they're doing. I said I had something for both of them. Thad started to say something about timing. Angie was getting Miles ready. They were actually heading out soon, and I said it would only take a few minutes. I asked him to get Angie. She came to the door with Miles on her hip. He saw me and said, "Grandpa," the way he always does, with the emphasis on the second syllable, and reached out his arms. I held him for a moment. He smelled like sunscreen. Then I set him down and Angie took his hand and I handed the envelope to Thad. He looked at it. "What is this?" "Letters from my attorney and from your Uncle Edmund," I said. "I think you should both read them." Thad opened the envelope there in the doorway. He pulled out the first document. I watched his eyes move across the page. His expression didn't change at first. Thad was good at not letting expressions change, but somewhere around the second page something shifted. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked up at me. "I don't understand what you're claiming here." "I think you do," I said. "Keep reading." He handed the second document to Angie. She read it standing there on the front porch in the morning sun, with Miles pulling at her hand, trying to get to the orange toy truck on the front walkway. I watched her face as she read. It was nothing like Thad's controlled neutral. It was the face of someone who had been hoping they wouldn't have to have this conversation and had just run out of road. "Dad," she started. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry and I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here because I deserve to see my grandson without paying a fee to do it. And I'm here because your husband needs to understand that everything in those documents is already documented. Every transfer, every date, every amount." Thad's eyes moved to Angie. She didn't look at him. Miles had gotten to his orange truck by then and was pushing it along the edge of the walkway, making engine sounds, completely unaware that anything was happening 4 feet above his head. We went inside. We sat at their kitchen table, the same table where Thad had once explained to me. At a Thanksgiving I would rather not remember. that my approach to retirement savings was suboptimal. We sat there for nearly 2 hours. Dad tried several framings. The money was always intended for household use. The separate account was for Miles's future. It was all documented on their end. He just hadn't thought to share that with me. The framings got less convincing as the conversation went on. Angie, to her credit, stopped helping him at a certain point. She just sat with her hands folded on the table and let him talk. At the end, Thad said he would need to speak to an attorney. I said that was a good idea. What followed was 3 months of conversations, some of which included attorneys and some of which were just Angie and me on the phone. I am going to be careful about summarizing those conversations because some of them were private and painful in ways that belong to Angie and not to this story. What I can tell you is that the money, most of it, was repaid, not all of it. $11,000 was contested, and Clifton advised me to let it go, that the cost of pursuing it would exceed the return, financial and otherwise. I let it go. Some things cost what they cost. The monthly payment demand was dropped. It was never mentioned again. The visit guidelines document was never signed by anyone. What changed, slowly and imperfectly, was something harder to name. Angie and Thad are still together. I don't know what their marriage looks like from the inside, and it's not my business to know. What I can tell you is that Thad no longer answers the door when I visit. It's usually Angie, or Miles himself if he hears my car in the driveway, which happens because 4-year-olds have no concept of a 48-hour notice requirement. Miles had a birthday in November. He turned 4. I drove over with a present. A wooden train set, pre-approved by no one because the approval requirement no longer exists. And we built the whole track together on the living room floor while Angie made coffee and Thad sat in the study doing something on his laptop. Miles was in charge of all the decisions about which curves went where, and I was in charge of snapping the pieces together. And at one point, he looked up at me with complete seriousness and said, "Grandpa, you're a good helper." I said thank you. He nodded like it was a fair assessment and went back to the curves. I keep a photo on my kitchen windowsill. It's 1 June took the week Miles was born, before she knew she was sick, or at least before any of us did. She's got him against her chest, this tiny bundle, and she's looking down at him with an expression I don't have a word for. Not just love. Something more specific than love, like she was recognizing something. I used to think the hardest thing after she died would be the quiet in the house. I was right about the quiet. I was wrong about what would come after it. This slower, stranger grief of watching a family reorganize itself around a set of rules instead of around a set of people. I'm not a confrontational man. I spent nearly 3 decades measuring tolerances, calculating whether a being could bear what was being asked of it. I don't escalate unless I have to. But there is a difference between not escalating and accepting terms that were never fair to begin with. If you're a grandparent watching this and you recognize something in this story, I want you to know a few things. Grandparent visitation rights are real in most states, including Arizona, and they are enforceable, not automatically, but with documentation and the right legal counsel. If you have given money to your child's household, document it. Write a letter. Have it signed. Specify the purpose, not because you don't trust your family, but because documentation protects the relationship if the relationship changes. I learned that the hard way, in Edmund's account in handwriting and Clifton's measured legal prose. And if someone you love is being slowly moved to the edges of their own family, say something, not loudly, not in a way that makes the thing worse, but say it. The person being edged out is often the last one to see clearly what is happening to them. Last month, Miles called me on a Saturday morning to tell me he had found a lizard in the backyard. He wanted me to come see it. I told him I'd be there in 30 minutes. When I got there, the lizard was gone. They move fast, Miles informed me gravely, as if I might not know this. But he had drawn a picture of it in crayon, and he gave it to me to take home. It has blue legs and approximately 14 toes, which I'm told is accurate. June would have framed it. She would have driven to the craft store the same afternoon and come back with a frame and hung it in the hallway and told everyone who visited about the lizard and the 14 toes. That's exactly the kind of thing she would have done. I know that about her. The way I know the weight of a load-bearing wall. Not because I have to think about it, but because I spent long enough paying attention. I put the drawing on the windowsill next to her photo. I used to think patience was a passive thing, something you waited inside, like sitting in a room until the weather changed. What I learned, the slow, expensive way, is that patience without a spine isn't patience at all. It's just permission. Thad didn't become who he was overnight. Neither did the situation. It built the way structural problems build, quietly, behind walls, in places nobody thinks to look until something gives. I spent 27 years checking for exactly that kind of failure, and I still didn't see it coming in my own family. That's the part that took me the longest to make peace with. What I kept coming back to, sitting at that kitchen table after the attorneys were done and the paperwork was settled, was the question of character. Not Thad's, mine. Because I had choices along the way that I didn't take. I could have pushed back at the first rule. I could have asked harder questions when the visit windows kept shrinking. I could have called Clifton a year earlier. I didn't, because I told myself I was being reasonable. And there is a version of reasonable that is actually just conflict avoidance dressed up in good manners. What finally moved me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The night I sat on the back porch looking at the orange tree June and I planted. That was the night I stopped asking whether I was being too sensitive and started asking whether the situation was actually fair. Those are different questions, and the second one is harder to avoid answering honestly, doing the right thing when it costs you something. That's what held me together through those 7 weeks of staying quiet, following the rules, arriving on time, sitting on their couch for 2 hours, not letting anything show on my face. I had to keep showing up decently even while I was building a case, because the moment I acted badly, I would have handed them a story to tell about me. Integrity isn't something you perform when it's easy. It's what you hold on to when everything in you wants to say something you can't take back. The thinking mattered just as much. I could have walked up to Thad's door with nothing but grievance and a raised voice. Plenty of people would have, and I understand why. But grievance without documentation is just noise. What Edmund's records and Clifton's letter did was turn something that felt wrong into something that was demonstrably wrong. Clear, dated, sequenced, irrefutable. The difference between those two things is enormous in a room with attorneys. And then there's the question of what you do with all of it afterward. Angie is still my daughter. Miles is still my grandson. I didn't go to that doorstep to burn the family down. I went to make something stop. There's a difference, and keeping that difference clear in my own head. Even when I was hurt, even when I was tired of being patient. That took more out of me than anything else. Miles handed me a crayon drawing of a lizard last month. 14 toes, blue legs. He was very proud of the accuracy. I put it on the windowsill next to June's photo and I thought, this is what all of it was for. Not the money, not the documents, not being right, just the chance to be in the room when a 4-year-old hands you something he made and wants you to have it. That's the whole thing, really. Everything else was just the work it took to get back there.